This is the second part to the webinars that are covering male reproduction. In the second part, we're going to discuss the male sexual act as well as the androgens produced within the testes and their effects on the body. The penis we didn't discuss in the previous webinar because it is obviously a structure important in male reproduction, but I'm putting it in this part because we're going to talk about the male sex act, which includes an erection. So if you look at a cross-section of the penis has these erectile tissues. It has two corpora cavernosa and one corpus spongiosum. These are tissues that you'll see that are surrounded here. These ones are surrounded by these blood vessels. You'll notice that the penile urethra runs right through the corpus spongiosum. Now, in a flaccid state, blood flow into these spaces, these are kind of like cavernous spaces, is minimal. But during an erection, we're going to have increased blood flow into these spaces, which are very important in an erection. Now, the erection is a neurovascular event. So if we look at the stages involved in the male sex act, you'll have, and it obviously start with arousal. So it could be emotional type stimulus, visual, it could be mechanical stimulation of the penis. These send impulses down via the spinal cord. And what happens is, which is kind of interesting, in that you have an increased parasympathetic activity to the penis, which are going to be involved in the blood vessels in the penis. We will have a decreased activity to the sympathetic neurons to the penis. And what happens is these neurons that supply the blood to the erectile tissue via the second messenger system that's involved in the parasympathetic in these blood vessels, parasympathetic nervous system, is nitric oxide will be increased by the blood vessels in response to increased parasympathetic nervous system activity. This, when it binds to its receptor, results in an increase in cyclic GMP production. This is the second messenger used by nitric oxide. What ultimately happens is that increase in cyclic GMP will result in a decrease in the intracellular levels of calcium, which relax vascular smooth muscle. So if you relax vascular smooth muscle, what will result is you get vasodilation, which increases blood flow. What happens is blood will start to flow into the cavernous spaces of that erectile tissue. It results in engorgement and an erection. Simultaneously, you get compression of the veins, which decreases drainage. So ultimately, you lead to an erection. Now, the erection obviously is necessary for insertion into the vagina in the female during sexual intercourse. Now, following the erection, in result of that will, in the purpose of reproduction is eventually to have ejaculation and fertilization of the egg. So you have to have the sperm leaving the male reproductive tract and entering the female reproductive tract. So what happens is you're going to get, as a result of sympathetic impulses, increase in sympathetic impulses to the smooth muscle that is involved in the vas deferens, the ejaculatory ducts, the erectile columns of the penis, the bulbourethral glands. A lot of things are involved is in response to this culmination of an intense sexual stimulation, an orgasm. This increase in sympathetic activity is going to do a multitude of things. It's going to increase the release of secretions from the various glands that we've discussed about in the previous webinar. The bulbourethral glands, that's going to lubricate, it's going to cleanse the urethra of urine. The prostate, seminal vesicles, are going to be releasing its secretions along with the sperm that are moving down the vas deferens into the ejaculatory duct, mixing with all these secretions. This is eventually going to move things out of the penis. And what happens, though, is there's certain terms you need to be aware of. The semen that moves through the urethra is now not outside the body yet. They refer to that as emission. So the movement of semen into the urethra is referred to as emission. When it's forcefully expelled from the urethra, that is your ejaculation. Now, the initial ejaculate will clot. It'll clump up. It's very clumpy looking. And the reason why that happens is the seminal vesicle, one of its secretions, is something old school, they called it vesiculase. Some people use the term seminogelins. Think of it as gel, seminogelins. These cause the semen to kind of clump up. So it gets inserted by around the area of the cervical os to kind of ensure that you have all the semen in one space. But eventually, very shortly after, fibrinolysin is a substance that's secreted by the prostate that will start to break that down. And so all of a sudden, that the sperm are ready, raring to go, and they're going to start to swim. So there's some other secretions that we didn't talk about in the previous webinar, but it's going to be important when the purpose is to get the semen in the right place and eventually up to fertilize the egg. Now, following ejaculation, you want the penis to go flaccid again. So while all of this is going, the sympathetic impulses are also active for the blood vessels that are serving the erectile tissue in the penis. And so what we're going to have is you're going to constrict the arteries. You're going to have which minimizes the amount of blood that's going to enter those cavernous spaces in the erectile tissue. Simultaneously, the veins are now not going to be compressed, so blood can be carried away, and then the penis becomes flaccid. And this period or stage in male reproduction, or the male sex act, referred to as resolution, and some people refer to as detumescence. What we need to talk about last is the androgens produced in the testes. What their purpose is, what are their functions. Now, obviously, they're going to play a role in spermatogenesis. They're also going to play a role in the maintaining the male sex organs, and some of the sexual secondary characteristics, and some other things that we're going to discuss. So let's first just look at the androgens that are produced in the testes. Now, this picture here in the kind of the pink, it's depicting what is going on in the Leydig cell. Because remember, luteinizing hormone binds to its receptor on the Leydig cell and stimulates testosterone production. Well, you'll notice that androstenedione is an intermediate in the production of testosterone. The major androgens produced that have effects on the male are androstenedione, because not all of it will be converted to testosterone, but androstenedione, testosterone, and also we're going to discuss is this thing called dihydrotestosterone, but that's produced peripherally. But within the Leydig cell, you're going to produce testosterone. Now, the testosterone that is going to be secreted into the peripheral circulation will be bound to plasma proteins such as albumins, and there's a specific binding globulin referred to as sex hormone binding globulin, and that will be transported to peripheral tissues, and we're going to look at what can be converted to, but also testosterone can also have direct effects on certain tissues. Whatever is we don't need, don't want, eventually it's going to be broken down in the liver, conjugated with something that increases its solubility, and eventually excreted from the body. Now what you'll notice is these hormones have this central steroid nucleus. These are steroid hormones, ultimately again derived from cholesterol. Being steroid hormones, they will bind to a receptor inside the cell and exert its effects by changing or altering gene transcription. So they will eventually change the production of proteins. Now what you'll notice on this picture is testosterone that's produced within the testes by the Leydig cell. That will bind to something called androgen binding protein, which is produced by the Sertoli cells, which is going to allow that testosterone to be heavily concentrated within the testes, which is extremely important in normal spermatogenesis. You have to have a very high level of testosterone locally for normal spermatogenesis. But also, which was discussed in the first webinar, the Sertoli cells express the enzyme aromatase, which catalyzes this reaction that you're seeing here. Testosterone can be aromatized into beta-estradiol. Now what you're seeing here is it can also be done peripherally by adipose tissue, but this step is also done within the testes by the Sertoli cell, which expresses aromatase. Now that estradiol in the testes is also important in normal spermatogenesis. We'll shortly show you that the estradiol that's produced peripherally also plays a role in the males. So males produce estrogens as well as androgens, and girls, we produce estrogens as well as androgens also. But we're going to be looking at, in the next slide, is looking at some of the effects that these various hormones have on the body, and including, I'm going to mention the beta-estradiol and its effects in the male. Now that is in your notes, so you'll have to make sure you write those down. But what we'll see is we're going to look at testosterone's effects and dihydrotestosterone effects, as well as the beta-estradiol effects. Now you'll notice here, testosterone will be converted to DHT. We were often referred to as DHT instead of dihydrotestosterone by an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. Now there's more than one type or form of 5-alpha reductase. There's one that's found in the skin. There's one found in other tissues. But overall, this enzyme is going to convert some of the testosterone to DHT, which has effects in utero, as well as effects when we talk about what happens after puberty. So if you look at this picture, I like this picture. I found it, so I include this. I got this picture directly off the internet. I googled Vernon-Levy, male reproduction, found this picture. You can Google it too and get the picture also. Now you'll notice that testosterone has a widespread number of effects. Now let's just talk about initially DHT, dihydrotestosterone. That has some effects in utero. So in utero, it is going to be important in just the masculinization of external genitalia in the male in utero. And it's also going to be important in the associated changes that you see at puberty, things like growth of the penis, growth of some of the glands associated with the male reproductive system, like the prostate. Prostate's one of them. The DHT also is important in facial hair growth, body hair production. There's the particular 5-alpha reductase that's found in the skin. It's the first isoform found in the skin that will increase sebaceous gland activity and is pretty much responsible for the acne that children get at puberty, and it's because of the DHT production in the skin. The DHT, which they don't have it really shown here, it also will cause the darkening and folding darkening and folding of the scrotum that's characteristic of a male once they hit puberty. You get increases growth of pubic hair as well as axillary hair. The testosterone, you'll notice testosterone has a multitude of effects. Similar, again, it can also have similar effects on the male reproductive organs. It increases muscle mass. Most people think about that when they think about the male. It's responsible for the changes that you see within the vocal cords, causes the lower pitched voice in the male. It increases red blood cell production. Males have a high red blood cell level. Skin gives them an advantage in sports because their capacity to carry oxygen is greater. It increases abdominal visceral fat. So you'll notice that, again, more males get kind of the beer bellies, and it's a response to testosterone, increases deposition of visceral fat in the abdomen. It increases some of the lipoproteins, the low-density lipoprotein, very low-density lipoprotein in the liver, and decreases HDL. Could that potentially, can you correlate that to anything clinically? But that's one of the things that testosterone does. Testosterone is definitively important in sperm production. Now, I need to emphasize now is that the testosterone needed for sperm production, it's the high levels of testosterone produced within the testes. In class, we'll discuss what happens is if you have administration of exogenous testosterone, what it will do to sperm production. But it's the testosterone that's produced within the testes itself that will be important for sperm production, as well as the estrogens and also DHT to some extent. Now you'll notice that over here on the skeleton, I have testosterone, and you'll see this is abbreviation for the beta estradiol, is both testosterone and estrogens are important in bone growth. The peripheral conversion of testosterone to estrogen occurs by way of predominantly within adipose tissue. Your adipose tissue has aromatase. That's where predominant production of beta estradiol occurs in the male peripherally. The estrogens, what it does is it is important in the bone maturation. Now here's something to think about. Estradiol, or estrogens, we can just say estrogen in general, will stimulate closure of the epiphyseal plates sooner than testosterone. So at some point, you do have closure of the epiphyseal plates. What happens if a male does not produce the estrogens as much? I'm just going to leave it there. So in class, you're responsible in class to ask me why I brought this up. So what does that have to play with the skeleton, the bone growth? Now, other things you'll notice here is negative feedback. testosterone in the periphery, estrogens, DHT in the periphery will all suppress gonadotropin secretion, luteinizing hormone as well as follicle stimulating hormone. Other thing that testosterone does is it's involved in maintaining the male libido, the normal behavior or characteristic behavior of males. That's another effect of testosterone and DHT. Now the control, since I had mentioned that the estrogens, the testosterone, the DHT are involved in this negative feedback control. So let's kind of look at this slide and kind of see how other factors and how the ones that we just mentioned play a role in control of the hormones. Remember, ultimately, the hypothalamus is responsible for normal male reproduction because that releases gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, the levels of that increase at puberty. So at puberty, you're going to start increasing the gonadotropin releasing hormone levels. This will increase the secretion of the gonadotropins by the anterior pituitary, FSH as well as LH. Remember, the target for luteinizing hormone in the testis are the Leydig cells, or also referred to as the interstitial cells of Leydig, which lay outside the seminiferous tubules. Now, those Leydig cells produce testosterone. The testosterone, we just mentioned some of the effects that it has, so it has a multitude of effects. Definitely going to be important in normal spermatogenesis. So locally within the testes, the testosterone, some of the testosterone is going to be converted by Sertoli cells into estrogens, which are important in spermatogenesis. Testosterone will promote the Sertoli cells also secreting factors that are very important in normal spermatogenesis. And remember, you need high levels of testosterone within the testes to do this, and Sertoli cells, remember, also produce androgen binding protein, which helps to concentrate it. The testosterone that's released into the peripheral circulation is what's responsible for the negative feedback. It's not the testosterone that's kept highly concentrated within the testes itself. It's the testosterone that's released into the periphery that will have a negative feedback effect on both the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. You also have inhibin, which is a hormone produced by the Sertoli cells, which what it does is it has a negative feedback effect on follicle stimulating hormone. This will try to keep spermatogenesis in check. So the Sertoli cells are trying to make sure spermatogenesis is not occurring too quickly or too much. So the follicle stimulating hormone, its target is the Sertoli cell. Remember, the Sertoli cell does a lot of different things that promote the normal spermatogenic pathway, going from the primitive spermatogonia to the spermatocytes and the spermatids, and eventually to the spermatozoa. So the FSH that's secreted by the anterior pituitary targets the Sertoli cells, which will definitely be important in spermatogenesis, but inhibin kind of keeps that in check. So we have inhibin inhibiting FSH because it's telling you that spermatogenesis is just occurring too rapidly. You have testosterone that's released into the peripheral circulation that can have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. But also, even though I don't have this on the slide, is estrogens and DHT also can have effects on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary and inhibit the secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone as well as the gonadotropins by the anterior pituitary. Now, just so you know what we're going to be doing in lecture is we'll also be discussing some clinical correlations associated with male reproduction. Some of the topics that we may or may not discuss, and we may have some other ones that come up, is the hopefully design of the male birth control pill. There is a loophole in the control of spermatogenesis in the male that we can utilize to our advantage in the design of a male birth control pill. We'll talk about the anabolic steroid use and its effects on fertility. Dilantin, you can Google that. It's a drug. What could it do to male reproduction? Marijuana, alcohol use. What does that do to male fertility? As well as perhaps something called androgen resistance. We may discuss defects within the androgen receptors or defects within the 5-alpha reductase enzyme that converts testosterone to DHT. So those are what we're going to be discussing, may or may not discuss in lecture.